Boom, 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 boom.
Welcome to the Good Energy Project with Lou Connor, a surprisingly hopeful show about the invisible economic forces that shape our lives, our homes, and our future on planet Earth.
Kia ora. Welcome to the Good Energy Project. It's Lou Connor here, and I've prepared something a bit different for you today. I've been reflecting on the interviews I've done and the books I've read and things I've been learning over the last year as I've been exploring the economics of homes and kāinga. And today I want to take you on that journey and to share with you the subtle yet profound ways that I feel like these learnings have shaped my life. So to begin with, I will also have my thumb piano with me. So I might play it as we go along. And to begin with, I have a poem from one of my favourite poets, Mary Oliver, and I want to share this as a kind of blessing on our journey. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot, or a few small stones. Just pay attention, then patch a few words together and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but the doorway into thanks, and a silence in which another voice may speak. So I want to take you back 1 year to about February 2024. I've been going on the Good Energy Project for just a little bit more than a year, and I've had so many inspiring interviews, and I've been learning all about the invisible economic forces that shape our lives. Something that comes to mind is right at the beginning of this journey, reading Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, and she talks about the rational economic man, which is this idea of humans that our capitalist system is based on. And this picture is just of this isolated individual that focuses on themselves and tries to gain as much as they can, like interested in money and collecting resources. And what I've learnt over that year was just that our capitalist system actually relies on us being like that. So this image formed in my mind of an industrial mother pig, which I've talked about before. You know, in order to survive in this system, we need to eat from supermarkets and we rely on banks and corporations to house and clothe ourselves. And I just had this sense of myself as this piglet kind of suckling the teat of this ginormous sort of so big that you can't actually see it, just sort of suckling away at this huge system. We're kind of isolated into small units so that we can't get sustenance from anywhere else. We just need to keep suckling. And we can, I can sort of put my head up for a little bit to look around and see what's happening. But unless I find some other source of sustenance, then I'm going to have to go back to suckling that pig. So that was that framed my journey, framed my questions for this whole project. And I think one of the biggest revelations that I've had over the last year is learning about the history of capitalism and its connection with colonization. The big eureka moment happened when I was listening to this podcast called The Book on Fire. And it's these two people they're actually herbalists from America called Janet and Dave. And they review books. And the one that I was listening to was Caliban and the Witch by the amazing feminist historian Silvia Federici. The subtitle of the book is Women, the Body and Primitive Accumulation. It talks about how capitalism began and how it took over from the feudal system in Europe, where there were lords and the church who owned the land and had the power. But within that, everyone else, like the peasants, had access to the common land, which they could use to feed themselves, and they had the forests they could gather from. So there was a certain amount of freedom within the system. They could maintain their connection with their land, which was probably often their ancestral land. So there were lots of fights at the time because people weren't exactly happy being lorded over by lords. Lots of fighting and uprisings, and in order to maintain their power, the common land was taken by the lords in order to produce stuff. So the basic premise of this book was that in order to get the capitalist system started, you need something called primitive accumulation, which means that in order to sell stuff on the market, you need to gather some extra stuff in order to make it, and you also need people to make it. So you need some land, and you need labor, and you need resources. And the sort of classic story goes that some people worked harder, and they were able to gather more stuff together, and so they were more successful, and they became the capitalists. And this is sort of the myth of how capitalism began. But Silvia Federici writes about the actual history, which was more like the people in power took the land and they co-opted people to work for them. And this didn't happen sort of nicely. It happened by force. And also she talks about how the process of colonization was necessary in order to get the resources and the people to work to be productive in this new capitalist system. In order to get men to work as workers, they needed women to look after the men. So this sort of explains the increased focus on the nuclear family and the sort of subjugation of women to men, and also the subjugation of some races to other races in order that they could be used for their productive labor. So it all became about being productive. At the start, there was a lot of force used, and they employed militia to actually control the people so that they would take part as workers in the system. So she talks about the witch hunts. One of the sort of reasons for the witch hunts was to get rid of the people that were objecting to these changes, which were often independent women. But as time went on, I guess they figured out that it was easier to have a shift in mindset and values. And so this idea of productivity being virtuous started to come about, and I guess the Protestant work ethic. And apparently people started to get wristwatches or like clocks. The whole idea that time is money and time needs to be used. Well, like before that, productivity wasn't a virtue because you just needed to make enough to meet your needs. And after that, you could focus on the important things like connecting with each other and making music and looking at the stars and things. Yeah, so, oh my gosh, I just found this quite mind-blowing. How connected the whole colonization process was with the capitalist system. Listening to this podcast, I could start to see the forces acting in our society that sort of created the fragmentation and the isolation. Because when we are separated and isolated from each other, we become vulnerable to control and manipulation. And we used to exist as part of this ecosystem that could sustain us, just like other animals or plants or other ecological beings. But separated from it, we become reliant on the system, and therefore we become willing to work in it and willing to offer our energy into it, which is the energy that makes it work. So this was a huge sort of epiphany or just coming together in my mind of different things that made a lot of sense. And here's an excerpt from the podcast that I feel like sums it up.
This book, it really demonstrates and painstakingly shows for us how all of life had to be remade for capitalism to be born. It wasn't just a new economic system where like money became more predominant and wage labor, yeah, that happened. But even for that to happen, so much of life had to be remade, and not just the everyday life as far as what a typical day would look like, but also all of our relations, our relation to the non-human world, and our relations to ourselves, even like what you think a person is and is for. All of that got remade in this period. And there was so much resistance to this restructuring of humanity, life, work, social relations, that this transition into capitalism, the birth of capitalism, was really brutal, really horrible, really violent.
So, yeah, here we are living in this fragmented society, suckling away at the industrial mother pig. And suddenly I could see the forces creating this difference and isolation. One thing I learnt from all the interviews in my first year was that we need to unite and work together to overcome these enormous forces of capitalism and colonization. But we're in this state of isolation and fragmentation, so how do we move towards this? Where can we start? And what comes to mind here is a metaphor. Like, I studied physics at university, so physics metaphors often come to mind. And I spent some time in my honours year growing crystals in the lab. So I was like grinding up different rocks and mixing them together and then putting them in a solution, and they'd form these little glowing crystals. I don't think I added much to the body of physics knowledge, but the physics of crystals interested me, because a crystal is a very ordered sort of lattice structure of atoms that all fit together in a very beautiful and ordered way. And the type of atoms and the way that they combine dictates the qualities of the material. For example, diamond and coal are made of the same atoms, carbon atoms, but it's just the way that they come together that makes the difference. In diamond, each carbon atom is bonded to 4 other carbon atoms in a rigid 3-dimensional network, and this creates a hard, transparent crystal. And in coal, the atoms are sort of loosely packed together in a random order, and that creates the black, opaque coal stuff. But the way that crystals form is through this process called crystallization, obviously. And before the crystals form, all the atoms are just floating randomly around together in a liquid or a gas. And a crystal can't just form anywhere. It needs a little nucleus or a little site to form around. In the case of a snowflake, this can be a little tiny bit of grit that atoms start to cluster around. But in other forms of crystals like diamonds, it can be just when a few atoms come together in the right formation, they form a tiny crystal nucleus or seed, and it's the shape of them together that is a starting point for the crystal growth. So all the other atoms around, they sort of see this orderly little tiny shape, and they connect to it, and from that seed, a vast lattice of atoms begins to form, and it can form quite quickly once you've got that tiny seed in the middle. So this metaphor sort of appeals to me when thinking about how to go from this sort of fragmented, disorderly society or state that we find ourselves in to sort of restoring some of those intricate relationships and networks that we used to have with the land and with each other. So at the start of 2024 last year, I felt a bit like a liquid or a gas of just random atoms without that nucleus or seed to form around. I had so many rich ideas and inspiration sort of floating around, but nothing had taken hold or started to form. And to give you some context, the last few years had felt like a big dissolution of the structures in my life. 5 years ago, I was living in a big shared flat in Island Bay in Whanganui Atara on the south coast of Wellington. I had a feeling of being in the middle of a big community and that we were creating something inspiring. I felt deeply connected with the land and the ocean, and at that time my mum and dad were living in our family home, which we'd had for 40 years since I was a baby. And every week my brothers and I would meet for a family dinner. I had the feeling that something in life was forming and I felt excited about it. Then there was COVID, and my partner and Rachel and I ended up moving out of the shared flat into our own place. Then my mum was diagnosed with dementia, and my dad, who was looking after her, suddenly collapsed and died. So my two brothers and I moved into our family home to look after mum and figure out what to do next. And we managed to get my mum a place in a rest home, and then we sold the family home. And then Rachel's family home was sold too, and her parents moved city up to Tamaki Makaurau from Napier. And so even though we still had lots of friends and family, it was like the structures had dissolved. We were unsure about where to be or what to put our attention on. And we were also stressed about money and feeling isolated and sort of very reliant on that industrial mother pig. So I'd been inspired by all the people I'd met and the conversations I'd had in this project. But at the time it felt kind of overwhelming, like I was swimming in a sea of people and ideas, but I had no sense of a centre or a way to ground the theories and create some kind of meaning. So I woke up one morning feeling particularly lost and down and not really wanting to sit down at my computer and start work or look at emails or something. And I wandered over to our bookshelf and a book jumped out at me. And it was one I'd picked up at the Hundertwasser Museum in Whangarei a few years earlier. It was called Kāinga, People, Land and Belonging by Paul Tapsell. I sat down outside on a mattress under the trees and I read it all day. What struck me was the way Paul described pre-colonial kāinga, which are the hapu or tribal villages or communities that were the centre of life for Māori before colonisation. Here's a little excerpt from the beginning of the book. Kāinga represent the fundamental, genealogically ordered relationship of belonging, anchoring tangata to whenua, in a universe organised by a system of ambilineal kinship and descent, or whakapapa. Kāinga are not just villages occupied by tangata, they are symbolic statements of mana, ancestral authority, over the surrounding whenua. So you see, each kāinga was the heart and centre of an intricate web of relationships. Just like the nucleus of a crystal establishes the pattern for the whole crystal to form, each kāinga established the order and harmony of the web of life that formed around it. But unlike a crystal, the relationships between tangata and whenua that formed around each kāinga were constantly shifting and changing as society and ecosystems evolved, to maintain the mauri, or the energy balance of the system. Here's another excerpt from the book. Like our elders and their elders before them, without even realising it, we were being trained to live within, respect and maintain the balance of our environment as an extension of ourselves. We were the whenua. When tangata are in balance with the whenua, so too is our energy system. The elders called that energy system mauri. Mauri drives everything, and it is everywhere, and it always finds and maintains a dynamic balance or equilibrium, according to the system in which it exists. I called this project the Good Energy Podcast because I realised that economic systems are all about the flow of energy. The economic system we're in tends to drain our energy, but here Paul was describing an energy system which maintained balance between tangata and whenua and was able to shift and adapt in response to changes. That's exactly what I've been looking for. In the book, Paul described that same process of colonisation that I'd learnt about through Silvia Federici and the enclosures of the land in Europe. that systematic separation of people from their kāinga and the dismantling of that intricate web of relationships that they maintained. So kāinga now are hanging by a thread. The laws and systems that have been in place over the last few hundred years have made it so hard for people to stay there and to maintain the systems, but there are still people who have managed to stay in touch. The hau kāinga have retained the knowledge of the whenua and the intricate relationships that once existed. These precious kāinga, these sort of crystal nuclei or seeds, still exist. So Paul's vision is to re-empower the kāinga as centres of economy and culture and ecology. And he believes it's still possible. But the thing is, we need to acknowledge what's happened. We need to sort of get over this amnesia that we suffer from. And we need to tend to the wounds of colonisation and work together towards restoration. He suggests that if we do this, we'll lead the world because it's so badly needed. It will be so unique and create such good energy that it would travel out and inspire people all over the place. And I love that vision. I'm imagining this intricate web of relationships reforming as people reconnect, like a crystal forming atom by atom. Paul and his wife Merita are engaged in this work. They're helping to connect young Māori who are in urban centres back to their traditional kāinga. And there's so much appetite for this. They're up against a lot, but the will is there to reconnect. And this was a vision that I loved and wanted to throw my weight behind. And I felt like that was what dropped like a seed for a crystal into my swirling matrix liquid of ideas and inspirations and confusion at the beginning of last year. And I knew what I wanted to focus on for the year, which was the economics of home and kāinga. It was like it gave me that core, and I suddenly could start and knew where to begin. On a very personal note, I think one of my hopes for this journey was that it would help Rachel and I to navigate our way to find our own home. We were living in Pōneke in a flat, and we loved it, but just something about losing that connection with the homes where we grew up in. It was like something was cut adrift, and we didn't know where we belonged or where we were needed or where we should be, and that was really difficult, not having that sort of sense of purpose or place. Neither Rachel or I have connections with ancestral kāinga. I do whakapapa Māori, but my family's connection was lost generations ago, and I've grown up immersed in Pākehā culture. So I was really interested in exploring what the role of Pākehā and tauiwi could be in gathering around this vision that Paul was sharing. To me, the Treaty of Waitangi is an invitation to belong here. It says, yes, you can be an atom in this beautiful crystal of Aotearoa. Let's swirl around and see what we can form together. I feel so grateful for that invitation. And so I'm interested in how we make our homes here, how we find our sense of belonging and grow those relationships and networks with each other and with the whenua. How might we help to restore the Māori? And if the vision of restored kāinga is the nucleus of a crystal, how might we form around it? What new order could this bring to society? I also wanted to broaden the theme to home as well as kāinga. And one of the reasons was that home feels quite radical in a feminist context. I was interested in lifting up and empowering and just sort of shedding light on the vital work that goes on in our homes, like caring and teaching and creating and loving and feeding the world. I feel like it's been so highly undervalued in our economy. I had this image that I saw at a workshop I went to of the economy being an iceberg. And on top of the surface, you've got the bits that are measured officially, like GST, basically. And then underneath the water's surface, you have all the work, all the energy exchanges going on that actually make the whole economy work. And I feel like home is such a key site for that. There's so much work and energy that goes in and that is exchanged and worked through at home. And yeah, that's what I was interested in exploring. That's where the magic I feel, could come from. So, my conversations on this theme began, and my first interview was with Anika Green, a young activist. She was 19 at the time and a student. And she was one of the inspired team behind the Make It 16 campaign to lower the voting age. I came across Anika because she replied to a call out that I made through Wellington Access Radio for young people who'd be happy to talk about their experience of the economics of home. Anika responded and said something about the theme struck a chord with her. And she talked about growing up in an inner-city Christian community in Wellington called Stillwaters. When she started to talk about it, I realised it was the same community that I used to visit when I was at university, like years ago. I used to go to their community dinners and church services. And I remember my visits as being kind of like entering into a warm, welcoming little haven within the sort of chaos of the city. So I had a real fondness for this place and this memory, and it was quite special that that's where Anika grew up. So here's part of our conversation.
The house that I grew up in when I was really young was this big, bright yellow building that used to be an art school. So it's a really funky building. And I grew up with lots of other adults in my house as flatmates in a community called Stillwaters, just as you're saying. It's an inner city community group that focuses on fostering a sense of belonging for people who aren't seen, who don't feel connected in their community and have been viewed with that lens of difference from other people. It was such a warm home to grow up in because it was always about manaaki and awhiing people. I guess from day dot it was always about having conversations and having kai with people who were from all sorts of different backgrounds.
Anika's home had an ethic of radical hospitality. She got to know sex workers, refugees, gang members, and she heard their stories at a young age and learnt what it was like for them and learnt about the forces in the world through their very personal stories. When she was 8, her family moved into a social housing apartment building. There they opened their home to the families in the building who were from all around the world, Vietnam, China, Ethiopia and India.
I remember our neighbours' days very vividly because it would be heaps and heaps of people coming out of the building to do all sorts of fun activities like face painting and having a sausage sizzle. And it was so nice to see. Like I said to you the other day, there was a lot of immigrant families who'd moved into that social housing apartment building. I was young at the time, but I could sense that there was a real sense of isolation for those families and the kind of being hit with the culture shock of it being such a different environment. Those neighbours' days were such a snapshot into what it could look like if people didn't feel super isolated and there were these opportunities people could take up to feel really connected to one another.
I was so moved by Anika's description of growing up without this idea of difference. It struck me that where capitalism is like this machine that creates difference, it's just like divide, separate, divide, separate, divide, separate, divide, separate. And in contrast, Stillwaters is like a difference dissolving machine. They're like, come together, bring together, and it moves out. In the middle of the city, which is, I feel, is sort of like a bit of a headquarters of the capitalist machine, they created the seed crystal, this sort of site of gathering, which provided a structure and a way of being that people were able to cluster around and connect. And it reached out across social divides and created threads of belonging and glue to hold people together. I remember when I used to go to services at Stillwaters when I was at university, I'd come in and sit down next to homeless people, and I remember singing my heart out and then eating and chatting with them afterwards. And there was something so good about connecting in that way. It felt fresh and real and such a welcome change from the homogenous vibe of university and the suburb I lived in. One thing I was really curious to ask Anika about was where they got all the energy from. Anika's parents worked full-time jobs and they had a family to raise. And I just wanted to know, where did they get the resources and energy to host so many people in their home and to kind of manage the chaos that I imagine would come with that? Here's Anika's response.
I think it's a really interesting looking at it as an older person now, because I don't think I had a full grasp of it when I was younger, how it all came together. But it all comes out of people's generosity. The groups that Stillwaters is connected to, the people that really see its work making people flourish and feel seen. So yeah, there's people that have been really committed to it for such a long time who've been extraordinarily generous.
I shared a little bit with Anika about my experience of living in a big shared flat and finding myself sort of getting drained. I think I was always interested in helping other people and found myself pouring all my energy in, and I loved it. So it wasn't like I was doing it out of any sense of obligation, but there was a feeling of like just an energy equation that wasn't working for me. I was pouring a lot of energy in and not getting replenished somehow. So I was very impressed and amazed to hear how Anika's parents managed it and how she manages it now. It struck me that there is some hidden well of energy that they're tapping into, and generosity seemed to be the key. Anika talked about when she was young, seeing the people around her being generous and being filled with this desire and this energy to give herself. It reminded me a bit of the Christian story from the Bible of the loaves and the fishes, when Jesus manages to feed thousands of people with a few loaves of bread and a few fishes. It seems like there's some alchemical law of energy here. Like abundance comes from generosity. It doesn't matter what you have. If you give it freely, it expands and multiplies. It also reminds me of Paul Tapsell talking about tuku and utu in traditional Māori economies. The balance is maintained by giving back more than you receive. One thing that Anika said particularly struck me. She said, when you know you're loved and you belong, it's easy to be selfless. It's like her ability to give is grounded in this deep sense of knowing that she belongs in her community. When your being is rooted in stable, nourishing soil, there's almost no end to the amount you can grow and provide. Imagine if we made that the basis for our economic system, if we put the resources towards making sure people had stable homes and were able to find roles that gave them a sense of belonging in their community. I think that would be an incredible foundation for a society. So I felt really inspired by this conversation, but I also noticed afterwards that something about it rocked me. It tapped into a longing that I feel to connect beyond my social bubble, and that's what I loved about my time going to Stillwaters all those years ago. But with this longing, I connected with a feeling of fear. I realized that I would feel afraid to open the door of my home in the same kind of radical way that Anika does. And I think, on reflection, I think that's got a lot to do with boundaries, knowing how to keep myself well and look after my own needs, or even recognize them in the presence of other people. And that's something that I've reflected on a lot and I'm sort of working on. And that's this sort of internal energy system that I think it's related to the industrial mother pig. There's an energy system there that is not conducive to being able to be in close connection with people all the time because it's not sustainable. I actually asked Anika about her ability to hold boundaries when people are coming into her home, and she seemed very confident about it and said her parents taught her very good boundaries and prepared her really well.
I think that they've raised me to be pretty strong in myself and confident to know how to deal with people, but also my parents have been really good on de-escalation stuff. So I've felt like when I've been helping with leading protests and things, like that all just feels really important to me, and I feel really appreciative that I've had that experience of watching people support people to de-escalate.
So I did lots of reflection after this conversation, And I thought about the contrast between Anika's home and the big yellow house, and my childhood home, a big greenhouse in the suburb of Karori in Pōniki. Like Anika's home, my home was loving and welcoming, and my parents invited all sorts of people to visit and stay with us. My dad had an affinity for people who were a bit different and having a hard time in the world, and he often took them under his wing. And I think that gave me an appreciation for difference and a real interest in all kinds of people. But unlike Stillwater's, my family belonged to the School of Philosophy, which at the time was quite cult-like. It's much better now, but back in the day, the leaders instilled a strong idea of separation and superiority from the rest of society. You know, because we meditated and were vegetarian, there's a real sense of us and them. And my parents didn't exactly agree with that, but they sort of fell in line. And as a consequence, we had very little to do with our neighbours or our wider community growing up. The landscape of my world as a child felt like a walled garden. I felt a strong sense of love and belonging inside, but I felt a little bit fearful and unrooted out in the world. And then, as I grew up, I realised I was too gay to feel totally accepted within the walls of this garden. So I left. But I think a lot of grief came from that, and ever since I've been searching for that sense of belonging and community. And it struck me that these early childhood experiences create a different internal architecture and energy system. And these are very powerful in the way that our lives form and the way that we interact with each other. So after my conversation with Anika, I was left with some big questions. How do you move through fear and a sense of difference to grow those skills to connect? How do you move from isolation to connection? After talking to Anika, I fell prey to some harsh self-criticism. Why don't I feel more open? Why do I stay in my privileged bubble? What's wrong with me? And this only made me feel worse and more shut down. I had to find some compassion for myself. You can't just rip yourself open. You have to begin where you are and tend to your needs and sore spots with love and care. All throughout my life, my home has been a haven where I've let my mask down and made sense of the world and been able to be creative and vulnerable. I feel a bit like an animal that needs a quiet space to hide away. So coming back to the metaphor of the crystal, it starts small with these very secure relationships. And that's what Rachel and I were looking for, that beginning shape, the relationships and the place that will help us grow and open. My next guest was my lovely friend Charlotte Shade. Along with her friends, she's discovered a magic formula, which is that if you buy a house together, you can save heaps of money, and that gives you lots more time for the important things in life, like making music and spending time together. We explored the energy equation of living with close friends and bringing up children. She talked about how it requires a good chunk of commitment and energy to get it set up right in the first place, and also to keep the relationships healthy. But the energy that small amount of work frees up is way bigger, and it totally makes it worthwhile. Her and her partner Mike call themselves time millionaires. Their mortgage is less, their costs are less, and they've had time to dedicate to their amazing band, which is called National Sensation. I want to share with you one part of the conversation that has particularly stuck in my mind.
I think one of the things that I have realised in a few of the projects that I've been part of now, and the law firm that I'm working in is one of these as well, you can just do things quite differently if you want. You just have to do it. You know, it's not necessarily going to be plain sailing, but when is life ever plain sailing? You know?
Yeah, it's hard. So.
There's going to be difficult things. So why not do something different and you know, give it a go? I think even if in our co-living arrangement, even if it stopped now and we all went off and lived in nuclear families for the rest of our lives, even the period of time that we've had co-living together I would never.
You'd never lose that.
Never lose it, yeah. So I suppose my hope is that people can actually take the step and do something different, because especially in New Zealand, where we have so much going for us, like we're so incredibly lucky to live in this beautiful country. We have lots of arable land, we've got lots of water, we've got a fairly permissive legal system in terms of doing things slightly differently. We can change the way that we do things.
Charlotte and her friends followed their sense of enjoyment and friendship to establish a crystal formation that works. The industrial mother pig may be powerful, but once you find these relationships that work, the energy flow is just more nourishing and enjoyable. If you have the gumption to do something different, you can find a way that works better. I suppose in reflection on that, I felt a bit sad that Rachel and I hadn't found our cluster of people to build a home with. And we did explore some options of living with friends and family, but nothing quite stuck or felt right. My next conversation was with Ellie and Ren, who are two of the conveners of Gathering at the Gate, a course for Pākehā and tau iwi to explore our ancestral heritage and how we can honour te tiriti o Waitangi in our lives. I'd just taken part in the course when we had this conversation, and it had a big impact on me. Part of that was learning more about the history of capitalism and colonialism, which was very much in line with what I talked about before, about Silvia Federici and the enclosure of the commons. But this kind of took it to a more personal level. They encouraged us to connect back to our own earth-honouring ancestors, wherever they might have lived, in Europe or Britain or Scandinavia or wherever, to sort of find sustenance and to find roots that we can draw strength from. My ancestors came from Lebanon and England, Ireland, Germany, France and Norway. And my Māori whakapapa is in Tairāwhiti. We were also encouraged to research our colonial ancestors who first came to Aotearoa and to find out what roles they played in the process of colonisation. And a lot of these conversations were very heavy because what we were exploring was horrible a lot of the time and dark. We were facing into the shadowlands of shame and guilt. It brought about questions of how do we relate to the wrongs of our ancestors? And do we actually belong here? Is it wrong to own a home when the land was stolen? A few years ago, I went to a treaty workshop and learnt about the details of how land came into private ownership in Aotearoa and the series of laws and injustices that were done to Māori in order to establish our economy today. My reaction to that was to want to have nothing to do with real estate. I felt kind of repulsed from engaging in this system that perpetuates that injustice. And I wondered if there could be a way to live that helps to put things right. But these wanderings sat alongside this longing to settle down and put roots somewhere and to belong and feel secure. Something clicked in me in the conversation with Ellie and Ren. It was something about how our relationship as Pākehā with this whenua is different to the Māori concept of tūranga waiwai.
I was just thinking, when you asked that question, Lou, like how many people on the planet don't live where their ancestors lived? That's one of the many things which sets Indigenous peoples apart. Having your ancestors, like your deep, deep ancestors buried in a place close to you is like an element of being Indigenous, which I'm not Indigenous, so I'm not looking for that kind of belonging. I know that I don't have that kind of belonging. And instead I have all these material privileges and I'm not seeking that kind of connection like tūranga waiwai or something anymore because, I don't know, maybe it is that sense of having the ancestors at my back and like Ren saying, like the mystery of how it might yet all unfold. That's pretty beautiful, you know, and also just like some kind of weird sense of solidarity with all the other diasporic peoples living on the planet. All dislocated in various ways that intersect with race and class and way.
A beautiful image forms in my mind here of all these humans broken apart and scattered from our places of origin, now floating together in this place. Just like when I used to make crystals at university, I'd start by grinding up rocks in a mortar and pestle and then mixing them together in a solution. Here we all are, floating together, ready to form something new. After this conversation with Ellie and Ren, this feeling of having to do the right thing dropped away. I realised that somewhere in my subconscious I'd held on to this idea that I was going to find a perfect place that I could belong in. That was almost anciently ordained or something. But that doesn't exist. I don't have to find the perfect community. It's more important to be in the mess together and to honour the relationships we have. Another thing that comes to mind here is my conversation with Hemi Hirimi the year before. I shared with him a little bit about where Rachel and I were at looking for a place to live, and this was his answer.
A key word in Indigenous scholarship is resonance. You know, you come over the hill, you see your harbour or you see your mountain, and the hair stands up.
Oh, yeah.
Water falls out your eye.
Oh, yeah.
It's the resonance that is a spiritual experience. And as soon as you try and question it, it goes away.
It almost makes me cry when you say that because I recognise that so much. When Hemi spoke about resonance, something relaxed in me. I've always felt in my body that Aotearoa is home. I remember returning from the UK in my early 20s and visiting Te Rei Kaiho just above Princess Bay and feeling the sensation of something dropping down in the centre of my chest. And resonance is a perfect word for that feeling. And I've always trusted that feeling of resonance. I trust it with people and places. It's like my navigation system. And yet something about learning about the injustices of colonisation have caused me to doubt my belonging here. So those words of Hemi's meant a lot to me. They felt like an affirmation that I can trust my body to find home. The theme of resonance came through strongly in my next conversation with Simone and Sarah from the Tākaka co-housing village in Mohua, Golden Bay. Simone is originally from the UK, and when she first visited Aotearoa, she fell in love, and she felt a particular resonance with the whenua in Tākaka. For years she had dreamed of building a community, and when she moved there, her vision began to shape around the place. When Sarah first met Simone and heard her describe her vision, she felt this resonance so strongly that she gave up her stable job and life in Pōneke to move to Tākaka and help. And they followed this sense of resonance or rightness through the extremely difficult process of establishing the village. They were constantly knocking up against a system designed for typical capitalist developers. They had to give up on some of their dreams, like tiny houses and composting toilets, to make the project work in time with the money they had.
So there just seemed to be like a lot of triggers that we had along the way that kind of forced the outcome, I guess.
We essentially had to become developers. We had to become housing developers, just without profit. We just started the project, and the project necessitated this, and then it necessitated that, and then the next step, and the next step, and the next step. Just sort of once you were on that track, there was no way for us to build this many houses in this time frame without doing that.
I was particularly moved by Sarah's journey with the village. After years of dedicating her life to the project, she finally moved into her home there, and she had this incredibly uncomfortable, difficult realization that it didn't feel like home. And so she actually made the decision to sell.
I moved into this home that I'd spent a long time dreaming about and thinking about, and I didn't have that resonance of like, this is home for me. And that I think was quite a hard thing to sit with. I've spent so much time and energy and much faith in this project and in these people, and I still love it on many levels, and obviously love the people, loved being Simone's neighbour, you know, and we dreamed about being neighbours. But I had this kind of deeper sense of like, this isn't home for me, and that was really sad. But Also, like sitting with a huge amount of gratitude that it exists, but also then my life took a turn and I live in an amazing home now with my partner and my baby part-time and another couple of women, and it's just a big, queer, lovely household. Lots of dogs.
And nice. And that's quite close to the co-housing village?
It is. It's like a 5-minute drive, and I'm spending time there as well. So I really I want to teach a yoga class in the common house. Yeah. So I feel like I'm sort of lucky in a sense, is that like I've found this much smaller pocket of community that works for me, because I think I did kind of know this as I was going along, but didn't want to accept that, like, because of the unit title model, the way the co-housing is built is that they're individual households intersecting with a whole. And I had always come from this like shared house.
Yeah, like the big shared house. Thing.
Yeah, and we lived together, and it was like,
and it's sort of a non-nuclear family kind of setup.
Yeah, it's an alternative kind of family, sort of extended family sort of structure, and I think there's kind of a different need that I had around like having a bigger household where different pockets of people and different people intersect in different ways.
I love the complexity of the story. The co-housing village was Sarah's reason to move to Tākaka. It was the nucleus of the crystal that she gathered around, and it's continued to grow and to shape the community around it. Sarah's move away wasn't a rejection of the village, it was a fine-tuning of her relationship with it, and a recognition that she needed to live in a more diverse home unit. I visited my next guest in her home on 12 acres of beautiful whenua in Kaitoke, in the foothills of the Tararua. Jessica Hutchings is of Māori and Indian descent, Ngāi Tahu, Ngāti Huirapa and Gujarati. She spent years fighting for Indigenous rights as an academic and activist, and now as a gardener. Sadly, a few months after I visited, Jessica's beautiful home burnt down. So I'm very aware of this as I share my reflections on our meeting. I felt so grateful for the manaakitanga and warmth Jessica showed me when I visited. Like many Māori, Jessica has long been separated from her ancestral kāinga. She bought the section where she now lives on the property market 20 years ago, and now she spends her life pouring her energy into restoring the mauri of that whenua. I was moved by her answer when I asked her what it's like to live on the whenua as a manuhiri or guest.
I find it really peaceful and really gentle, actually. And we're very purposive and very clear that although we're Māori, definitely not mana whenua. We see ourselves as manuhiri, as visitors, as guests on somebody else's land that we steward. We wouldn't even use the word kaitiaki because for me kaitiakitanga is connected to that kaupapa of mana whenua, of having mana over the whenua. We have this privilege to kind of look after this land in the best way we can.
That's really nice to hear that it's quite relaxing. Did you say relaxing or was it another word? Gentle, maybe.
At peace with it. Clear about our standpoint and the obligations that are bestowed on you when you live on a piece of whenua and have the deep feeling that you're manuhiri.
This was inspiring to me. It's helping me to understand how different the notion of tangata whenua or mana whenua is to our capitalist idea of ownership. These words speak to a relationship that goes back generations and signifies a reciprocity with the whenua, a shared identity. Unlike capitalist ideas of property, it doesn't shut other people out. I even kind of get the sense that it's a foundation for other relationships to form. So manuhiri is not a disempowering position. It enables us to give and receive and weave our connections with tangata and whenua. These shifts feel subtle but profound. After talking to Jessica, I felt as if a barrier had been removed. Interestingly, at the time I interviewed Jessica, Rachel and I were deciding whether to make an offer on a house in Paikakariki. For about 3 years we'd been in this limbo wondering where to be, and this process of exploring the economics of homes and kāinga had sort of loosened something for me and made more seem possible. Rachel and I had this visioning session where we allowed ourselves to dream about what we longed for in a home. And what happened kind of surprised us. We realized that we both wanted to leave the city. We longed for dark skies and ocean, a queer creative community. And even though we wanted to live with other people, we realized that just for now we longed to have a little place to ourselves. The way we found this house felt very resonant. Something about it just felt right. And to cut a long story short, we did make an offer and it was accepted. And now we live here and it's such a blessing. A few weeks after we arrived, Pākehā had its annual Pride Parade, which felt like a welcoming party just for us. I've joined the Mermaids, which is a group of women who swim every morning, and I've also joined the community garden. It just feels like somewhere where we can settle and find the relationships we need to grow something new, maybe like our own crystal nucleus. But to finish my story off, there's one conversation I haven't told you about yet, and it's a very special one. I was very lucky to meet with Paul Tapsell, the inspiration for my journey, in his ancestral home in Rotorua last August. It was just a few days after Rachel and I had found out that our offer on the house had been accepted. And the conversation felt like a blessing on this new phase of our lives. Paul spoke about the history of colonization in Aotearoa and the enormous cultural divide it's created, as wide as the Grand Canyon. But we pretend it doesn't exist. We have this historic amnesia that's allowed us to create an illusion of a harmonious bicultural society. Paul challenges us to wake up from that illusion and to reach across the cultural divide. And despite everything that's gone down over the past 200 years, he still seems to have faith in the fundamental goodness of people, including Pākehā.
I think most reasonable non-Māori citizens of this country, if they understand the history, are more likely to respond proactively and create that bridge across the canyon and meet halfway.
Paul offered this beautiful invitation to return to our place in the web of life that supports us, to stop this silly capitalist habit of separating ourselves from each other and from the whenua.
My father-in-law used to talk about, when we talked about tangata whenua, his description was tangata being the people of the soil, not of the land. It's the soil that carries the essence to which we recycle from the planet, and it gives nutrition back. And all the biome that goes with that, from the different microbes, fungi, bacteria, everything that the soil represents. And it's all in balance. That's modi, balance. And once you've got that balance, then you can grow what it's balanced to grow. And we're part of it. We're not separate from it. But at the moment, the healing of the tangata is actually the healing of us understanding we are part of the system. If we don't make that shift to becoming part of the system, seeing we are, literally the world is our lifeboat, and we've got to stop shitting in our own nest and actually be a bit more smarter about that. But we've got so much fractured societies across here, whether it's from the Gaza Strip through to what's happening in Sudan at the moment or in the Ukraine. Those human qualities of us and them, that's our tipping point crisis. If we don't get beyond that, we will take the planet down with us. So the next generation coming through is how this, I believe, will be healed. They've got to be bigger than our generation, generations before us, and say, enough's enough. We actually want a future where we're going to be part of a planet that's going to be sustainable.
I feel so grateful for this conversation with Paul, and with all the conversations I've shared with you. Somehow, miraculously, this exploration of the economics of homes and kāinga has helped me and Rachel to find a home. We followed our own sense of resonance and listened to our longings. And now we're here, we're feeling a call to dig our hands into the soil, to make compost and grow a garden. It feels like the beginning of something new, and I'm really looking forward to sharing that with you as it develops. For now, I'd like to leave you with a blessing, which comes from a zine put together by Gathering at the Gate. It's full of poems, incantations, and blessings written by the participants of the course. This one is by Miriam Sherritt. It's called May We All Find More Patience. Gratitude to those who listen, those who take the time to understand all beings. May we all gain more patience for listening. Gratitude to the stargazers who recognize the ancient threads and experience the fabric of the universe. May we all gain more patience for stargazing. Gratitude to those in relationship with the ones who feed, clothe, and shelter us, those who live and breathe reciprocity. May we all learn relationship and leave behind power over. But most of all, gratitude to the water, earth, fire, and wind that gives life to all bodies. In a seemingly unconditional way, may they have patience with us while we learn to come home. That was the Good Energy Project with Lou Connor. If you like this show, you can subscribe at thegoodenergyproject.substack.com or listen on Spotify, Apple, or most other podcast platforms. My funding for this project is unfortunately running out, so if you're keen and able to support me financially, that would be incredible. You can sign up for a paid subscription on Substack, or get in touch if you have any other ideas or just want to get in touch. Thanks so much for listening.